Anthony Peake, welcome to the program.
Hello, Vincent. How are you? Do you go by Vinny, don't you?
Yeah,
Right. Hello, Vinny.
I have many names ascribed to me, kind of like the devil. Would you tell us a little bit about who you are and what it is you do?
Who I am and what I do. Well, there's $1 million question. I'm a writer based in the UK, and for the last 10 years, I've been focusing in on writing a series of books about human consciousness and how it relates to reality. Effectively, I started off with a fascination about the phenomenon that is generally known as deja vu, or more technically termed deja vu, and I've always been intrigued as to exactly what is happening when I have deja vu sensations. And around about 10 years ago, I was in the position that I could spend some time writing a book on the subject. And a year later, I ended up writing my first book. It was called Is There Life After Death? The Extraordinary Science of What Happens When You Die. And effectively, in that book, I came up with a fairly astonishing hypothesis about what happens to human consciousness at the point of death, which is to many degrees scientifically valid, in the sense that I'm not one of these guys that comes around and makes extreme claims. I'm not somebody who claims that I'm actually channeling information from the planet Tharg. I'm not talking to 15,000-year-old Atlanteans or people from Lemuria. I'm actually the real deal, and I deal with a lot of very, very serious scientists around the world, including neurologists and psychologists and such like. And I genuinely believe that what I have to offer has a degree of logic to a lot of people, in the sense that now I'm in the process of now finishing my 6th book, and I've got somewhere in the region of 40,000 sales of books behind me now, with various foreign language translations. And indeed, I'm off to Zagreb in a few weeks' time to do a book launch over there for the first Croatian edition of my first book. So basically, I'm just a seeker after truth, a little bit like you guys are. And sometimes I feel that sometimes I'm getting dangerously near to something that, well, I definitely seem to be joining the dots, let's say, in terms of what I'm trying to do.
When you say dangerously near to something, do you think that there's any inherent danger in what you're doing?
People have warned me that this is the case, basically because if what I write about is correct, then the things I write about have been known for a long, long time by the elites. These are things that have been kept secret either within esoteric belief systems, within various secret societies and such like. But effectively, my next book, I'm dealing with the pineal gland, the endogenous generation of dimethyltryptamine within the brain, and I've been coming up with some surprising parallels between what I'm finding out now and some of the things that have been taught within esoteric areas of Masonic belief systems for centuries. For instance, the idea of Kundalini awakening, how that works neurologically, these kind of things.
Kundalini. What is the Kundalini awakening? Because a lot of people would think it's some kind of pasta meal.
They couldn't they? Probably it could be a severe form of indigestion, and I suspect that many people that do have Kundalini awakenings are actually probably after a bad curry a couple of days before. But basically what a Kundalini awakening is the sensation that you feel something is searing up your spine, from the bottom of your spine right up your spinal cord, to the center of your brain, when there's suddenly this incredibly explosive feeling in the center of your brain, as if you're suddenly accessing information from places that ordinarily you wouldn't be able to do so. In other words, I argue you're going deeply inward in terms of drawing up information from something called the 0-point field, the quantum energy field. And again, this sounds...
You talked about this as though it's a field and almost a shiver coming up your spine, the hairs on the back of your neck standing up and things of that nature. And something that popped into my mind there is that actually at dance parties and festivals and things of that nature, when musicians are playing incredibly loud and they have songs with a lot of power and meaning, etc., that kind of feeling is something that I have actually experienced in those situations, because it's almost as though it's almost as though a sound field has resonated with me somehow and made me remember something. Do you know what I mean?
I know exactly what you mean. Funnily enough, one of the people that I'm associated with is a guy who works in Montreux in Switzerland, and he's been working using sonics, and he has this incredible hi-fi system where he uses sound to generate and make the brain vibrate in a particular way, which actually is an argument to say, again, can actually start generating endogenous dimethyltryptamine, in which case you start to have these strange sensations. Of course, shamanic drumming is something that does a similar thing. It's the idea if you get repetitive beats in a certain way, they will make the brain resonate in a certain way. And when these resonations hit a certain level, the brain starts to generate certain neurotransmitters, which then opens up a portal into alternate realities, for want of a better term. You know, effectively, we start to perceive things that we ordinarily don't. Now, funnily enough, I did a radio interview with one of Ireland's top DJs a few weeks ago, and we were discussing off-air this very idea of music and sound and how this works. Because if you look at it anthropologically, you know, people have been dancing into forms of frenzy, for want of a better term, for millennia. And it clearly does bring about this sensation. Now, again, guys that are in the clubbing world will also know something called the K-hole and ketamine, and how ketamine brings about out-of-the-body experiences. And my previous book was, in fact, about the out-of-the-body experience and how that is generated neurochemically. So there is a lot of truth in what you're saying there. And I know from when I was younger, when I used to go clubbing and things and going to festivals, I know the sensation you get, you know, and I do know you do go somewhere else. It's a trance state almost. Well, that's why that kind of music's called trance, isn't it?
Well, and again, if that is a possibility, then have there been any experiments or programs of such a nature where they would roll through the spectrum of sound frequency to test the reactions to each frequency on the brain to see which one, or if many of them, tap into this higher form of consciousness?
There's been work done by a guy called Michael Persinger at the Laurentian University in Sudbury in Canada. And what he's been doing, he's been working with certain resonances of sound. What he did is quite intriguing. What Persinger did was he took, I think it was an American football helmet. And what he did was he placed electrodes inside the helmet and stimulated areas of the brain with subsonic sound. And he was able to generate in certain people something he called the sense presence. And it was the idea that somebody was close by, somebody was standing close to them. And of course, this is very much related to sleep paralysis, the sensation when you're in this semi-hypnagogic, semi-awake, semi-asleep state that you sense that there's something else in the room. It's called the hag, and the idea that there's something else there. Now, Persinger came to a fascinating conclusion that he decided that this would explain a lot of hauntings, because they found that many hauntings are actually located in houses that either have running water underneath them or have something to do with the electricity system or the central heating system that resonates at a certain level, which actually stimulates the brain to have these sensations, specifically the temporal lobes of the brain. And this is why people who experience something called temporal lobe epilepsy have these sensations all the time. And in fact, I'm in contact with quite a few temporal lobe epileptics around the world who regularly have these sensations and feelings. So clearly it is to do with sound. It's also to do with light. There are certain resonations of light that can actually stimulate these things as well. Also, deep meditation can bring them about. So it's not just exclusively particular sensations. It's a mixture of the sensations, and these all can bring about these alternate states of consciousness.
So what about if there's, say, intersecting fields, like, let's say, one's a resonating frequency type field, and another one's a temperature, and another one, so on and so forth. One of them's food, one of them's water. And does that mean that perhaps there is a balance to be struck here at some point between what your diet is, how much water you're drinking, what kind of music you're listening to, and what kind of people you're associating with, what kind of thoughts are going through your head, what kind of media you're absorbing. And I was just thinking about this the other day, is that as somebody who understands about the New World Order and 9/11's an inside job and what have you, there's an inherent kind of scariness with the adjunct of the information. And what becomes apparent to me is that once your eyes are opened to this new reality, you cannot close them again. Very similar to how Neo in the Matrix was woken up and cannot be plugged in, because once you have been plugged back in, despite the fact that you eat that steak and it tastes juicy and delicious, you know that it is a lie, and you cannot enjoy something that is a lie, no matter how delicious it is. And that can be, I think, a metaphor for having an awakening, just in general, any whether it be a spiritual or an intellectual awakening. Do you think so?
I think in many ways it's more than a metaphor, in the sense that if you go into the background of the Wachowski brothers and the reason why they did the Matrix movie, it's profoundly Gnostic, and it's dealing with Gnostic belief systems and the idea that what we exist in is Maya. It's an illusion, it's a brain-generated illusion. Now, either it's generated by our own brains or it's generated externally to us. Now, effectively, I have recently been asked by my publisher to write a new biography of the American science fiction writer Philip K. Dick. And if you read a lot of the Philip K. Dick work, and which I've been immersing myself in over the last few years, what you'll effectively find is that's one of the things he argues about, is what is real, what is the nature of reality. Because if you think about it, the only way we perceive reality is through our five senses. And of course, the reality itself is processed by the brain. It's presented by the brain to consciousness, whatever that is, whatever it is inside your head, the little homunculus, the little man in the brain that supposedly processes everything, receives all the information secondhand, to the extent, for instance, that even if you look at sight and you realize that as you're looking out now, there is a blind spot, and your brain consistently covers up that blind spot. Now, ironically enough, not ironically enough, wrong use of word there, but a few months ago, I was discussing this very issue with my optician when I was explaining to him, and I was saying the kind of stuff I write about human perception and how perception is perceived in the brain. And I said one of the most intriguing things is about the blind spot. And he turned around to me and he seriously said, we can explain the blind spot. You have stereo vision. As you look through both of your eyes, the eyes superimpose the image to give you a full screen. And I said, so what happens when I close one eye then? And he looked at me and he went, I'd never thought about that. And that is the way people think. They get received wisdom. Even professional people like that never think about that. They think the explanation of the blind spot is because we have stereo vision. So why, when we close one eye, do we still not see the blind spot? And what happens is the brain makes up the information from around it to give you the full picture. Now, consciousness studies individuals around the world have a term they use for this belief that the reality we perceive is the reality that's outside. They call it naive realism. And naive realism is what 95% of the population out there believe. It's not as it is. If you think about it, a photon of light hits an object, bounces off the object, enters your eye. It then goes through the lens of the eye, and as it does so, what technically happens is that photon hits an electron and causes that electron it absorbs that light and causes another electron and gives that electron to give off another photon. And that does through your aqueous humor in your eye, back to the retina of the eye. That signal is then turned into an electrical signal, which is then sent down your optic nerve to your visual cortex of your brain. It is then processed in the visual cortex and then is presented to consciousness as a picture. The photon has long gone. The original photon has long gone. The original picture has long gone. So what you're perceiving is not what's out there. A guy called Richard L. Gregory is one of the world's leading authorities on perception studies. And if you ever get the opportunity, he actually writes a book about vision and the mysteries of vision. When people pretend they understand vision, they don't. They haven't got the vaguest idea of how our vision works.
Well, I think this is starting to be one of the most interesting interviews we've had on this show. So stay tuned, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes with my very special guest, Anthony Peake from AnthonyPeake.com. That's Peake, AnthonyPeake.com. You can get his books there and the rest of the stuff as well. A lot of material available there. We'll be right back. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Vinnie Eastwood Show on AmericanFreedomRadio.com, broadcasting live on AM/FM stations across the United States, and we also have wonderful affiliates here in New Zealand, Rush FM in Hamilton and iFinity FM in the South Island. And also, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to share with you an idea I had. I don't know if it has any validity, but you know how, have you ever heard the story of Johnny Appleseed, Anthony? Anthony, are you there?
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I have, yes. Yeah.
All right. Dude, and for those of you who are unfamiliar, dude figured out that there were a hell of a lot of, problems with people being fed or getting decent alcohol around the United States or whatever. So he cruises around and he's just planting seeds all over the place, just planting seeds. And sure enough, apple's abundant. People have got their apple pie, apple cider, apple this, apple that. They got everything they need, okay? Now, think about that, but instead of planting seeds in a literal sense, think about it as planting seeds in an intellectual or a, more to the point, a technological media sense. That's what I wanted to do, is travel the world, and stay at somebody's house or whatever, just plug in my Mac and my microphone and whatever and do the show, and be there for a short period of time and set up a wee media apparatus and somebody to run it, and then move on to the next area. So, just move on and plant radio show hosts and new radio stations and new TV and stuff like that. Just all cheap, somebody doing it from home, virtually no cost involved whatsoever with the bare minimum of equipment. And then from that, after I returned back home to New Zealand after this world tour or whatever, there's suddenly a global network full of independent people who don't need me to help them, who can report their own news.
Self-redundancy.
That's my goal is to make myself redundant.
Well, that's what we all want to do, really. We want to put seeds. I think it's an excellent idea. I mean, this is what I consider myself to be, an intellectual terrorist, in that I put seeds in people's minds to make them think. And what is happening now, people are going out there and taking my books and taking my ideas, and there's thousands of them around the world. We have a term for ourselves. We call ourselves Itladians. And Itladians is the initials of my first book, Is There Life After Death? And if you go on the web and you look up the term Itlad, it's out there. It's out there in the megasphere. Everybody's talking about it at the moment. Now, I want to focus in very, very quickly. I notice in the chat room there's been a couple of fascinating questions that I really am keen to just get my teeth into here. Because somebody's actually asked, how does our brain process the images we see in meditation with our eyes closed? Fantastic question. I'm actually now finishing my next book, which will be out, I think, in probably about 6 or 7 months' time. And in this book, I'm dealing with inner light. I'm dealing with the light that is drawn up from the 0 point field. Now, I don't know if people are aware out there, but inside the cells of the body is something called bioluminescence. And bioluminescence is light photons that are actually given off by cells. Now, this light is actually generated by DNA. Now, effectively, DNA, I am arguing in the new book, is intelligent. DNA is an entity. DNA, it guides us. And in fact, if anybody out there has ever taken ayahuasca and has written and has read the books of people like Jeremy Narby, you will discover some fascinating information about how people encounter in ayahuasca dreams.
Speaking of
snakes.
Which, what do you call somebody who has a bad reaction and gets really aggressive when they take it? Ayahuasca the Grouch.
I don't know. I like it. That's good. But going back to the subject of inner light, I argue that if you look through the history of esoteric beliefs and mystical beliefs, there is always this idea of the inner light, the light that comes from within. And I argue in my book, and again I'm doing the science in the new book, is to how this inner light is generated. Now, somebody's asked an even more fascinating thing, the lost sense of time in altered states of consciousness. My second to last book was called The Labyrinth of Time. And in this book, I deal with exactly that. I'm absolutely fascinated by subjective time experience. Why it is time seems to dilate under certain circumstances, it seems to slow down. Arguably, this is brought about by a substance in the brain called glutamate. And glutamate is the major neurotransmitter of the mammalian brain. It is also known to slow down time. Again, some of your clubbers out there will probably, if you've actually ever been in the K-hole and taken ketamine, you will know this is exactly what ketamine does. So does dimethyltryptamine. So does various other mind-altering substances, terms that are generally known as entheogens. Entheogens are actually drugs that let you acquire or see the universe from the point of view of God, for want of a better term. Somebody else about this, the compression of this now, how is it we're losing the day relative to a few years ago? I think the answer to that is we're aging. We're all aging, so therefore, as you get older, time slows down for you. And this is a fascinating idea as to why this may be. And there's been various work done on this. And the argument is that as we get older, the amount of time that we have had to build up experiences means that things that are unique are less unique, in the sense that when you're very, very young, everything is new. It's the holiday concept, isn't it? You go on holiday, and you're away on holiday, and the holiday seems to last forever because everything's new and unique. Whereas in your everyday life, things are less than unique, and therefore time seems to slow down for you. That's one alternative explanation. The other explanation is that it is to do with your body temperature. As your metabolic body temperature gets higher, your perception of time slows down. Time seems to slow down when you have a fever. And this again is directly linked to the neurology of the brain. Now again, something that really intrigued me was the idea of time slows down when you're under periods of stress, which again is a known fact. There's probably listeners out there who will relate to this so strongly. You're in a car crash, you get given bad news. Time just suddenly slows down and to a certain extent can even stop with certain individuals. This is because time is a subjective experience. It's the only thing I know that's measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples, but you can only have a minute of a minute. You and I could both agree that a clock time minute has taken place, but the reality of the situation is our perception of that minute could be completely and utterly different. And people confuse clock time. A clock is measuring distance. It's not measuring time. It's not measuring duration. If you look at a clock, it's moving from, say, the 12 to the quarter past. That's distance. It's not time. You know, even Einstein said that, you know, one of the biggest illusions is time. In the quantum world, time could go backwards or forwards. For instance, again, this is something that a lot of people are probably not aware of. Positrons. You know, you have these positron emission devices in hospitals, PET scans. Most people aren't aware of what a positron is. A positron is an electron going backwards in time. It's a positive electron. Paul Dirac came up with this conclusion back in the late 1930s. And indeed, there is a guy that's come up with something called a transactional interpretation of quantum physics that says that reality is actually brought about by positrons reacting with electrons. And the present moment is literally created by the interaction of forward time moving electrons reacting with backward time positrons.
Does that mean if you let's say it's like water, okay, two different streams of water, one coming from the left, one coming to the right, and when they come together, they forge a fountain that pushes together and then upwards, right, like a geyser. That's the backward moving through time, the forward moving through time. If you change the current, or if you manage to divert that flow, would it be possible for you to travel down either of those currents, like to travel back up them and ignore the other part of it?
You possibly could do, but the issue with this is to where you would go. Now, I don't know if you've come across Everett's many worlds interpretation of particle physics.
No.
It was put forward by Hugh Everett III was a research PhD student. And in 1957, he did his PhD thesis trying to explain the mysteries of something called the Schrodinger's cat experiment. And it would take me a long, long time to explain this, but effectively, what it is trying to explain is that if you take the implications of the classical interpretation of particle physics as suggested by people like Niels Bohr and Born and de Broglie and various other researchers in the 1920s and the 1930s, reality comes into existence by the point of observation or the point of measurement. It's called the measurement problem. For instance, if you take a light beam and you don't measure it, it's a light beam. The moment you try to measure a light beam, it becomes a point particle. It changes from a wave to a photon. Now, the difference between a photon is a particle, whereas a wave is a disturbance in another medium. Okay? They've done these experiments time and time again. It's called the twin slit experiment. And if you want any reductionist scientist to have a heart attack, just ask him about the observer problem and the twin slit experiment, and he will bullshit you and he'll try and get around it all. But the point of the fact is absolutely totally known, and it is the fact that the act of measurement makes the wave turn into a particle. Now, not only this, but these experiments have recently been done with molecules, large molecules. There's a guy called Anton Zeilinger at the University of Vienna. And again, I could be bullshitting you here. Just look it up on the web. This stuff is kept very, very secret because people don't want the masses to know it. Zeilinger has discovered that very, very large molecules, something like called a buckyball. A buckyball has 60 atoms in it. It's a huge spherical molecule. They have found that this molecule, when it's not observed, is a wave. The moment a consciousness takes it into account, it becomes a particle. The world you see around you is made up of molecules. Everything we see is made up of molecules. Molecules do not exist if you don't look at them. This is what Einstein said when he said he did not believe that the moon wasn't there when he looked at it. It's because he could not accept the implications of the Copenhagen interpretation. Now, what Hugh Everett III did was he came along and he said, I have a solution to this. He said, because what happened was Erwin Schrödinger came up with a thought experiment, and he said, if particles only become into existence at the act of observation, what happens to something that's unobserved? And he said, imagine you place a cat in a sealed box, and inside that box is a group of particles that are attached to a sensor with a little hammer that will open up a little hammer which will smash a glass full of cyanide. If the particle reacts in a certain way, the cyanide is released and the cat dies. If the particle doesn't act in a certain way, the cat survives. Schrödinger said that means that in any period of time, if it's unobserved, the cat is both alive and dead in the box at the same time. What Everett said was that when the box is opened, the scientist, one side splits into two scientists. One sees a dead cat and one sees a live cat. Okay, very difficult concept to grasp. And
Can I provide the analogy here? There was a story about Columbus coming into the Caribbean, and at the time the peoples of the Caribbean had never seen a sail ship or anything like that, and they were incapable of perceiving it whatsoever. Even when the ship was right in front of them, they still couldn't see it, and it took shaman to in fact help the others before they could even see what was really there. That's not anything like what you're talking about, is it?
It's to a certain extent it is. I mean, I always think that story is somewhat apocryphal in that it's done the rounds. My argument would always be who actually asked the Amerindians at the time, or the Native Americans at the time, whether they saw the ships or not. But it is an extension of something called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is that our language modifies the way we perceive reality. In other words, if you don't have a word for something, you won't necessarily perceive it. For instance, Hopi Indians Edmund Lee Sapir, when he did his analysis of Hopi Indians, found that the grammatical form of Hopi language means that an object's verb, a verb attached to an object, changes dependent upon the object's shape rather than its color. So young Hopi Indians, this was in the 1930s, would define the world by shapes. So in other words, they perceive the world quite differently to the way we do. And the argument is that our language structures the way we perceive reality. But if there's an argument to say that if we cannot categorize something, if we see something, we cannot categorize it, or no, more arguably, if we see something and we can categorize it in something we understand it to be, that's where we'll place the category. Whereas the reality might be completely different. For instance, we were talking earlier on offline about UFOs. You know, there could be an argument to say that UFOs do exist. It's just that we are perceiving them in completely the wrong way.